The subcommittee will come to order. Good afternoon. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. The subcommittee is convening today to examine the implementation of certain Coast Guard programs, including those involving performance monitoring, the service's capital investment plan, and commercial fishing vessel safety. It is important that Congress understands the Coast Guard's ability to meet its missions. The Coast Guard conducts search and rescue, drug interdiction, and defense readiness activities on a daily basis, yet it is unclear how the service tracks these activities. Members of the committee rely on the service to report its performance to Congress and to the public. To ensure a full understanding of the service's abilities, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2016 required the Government Accountability Office to look at whether the Coast Guard's annual performance goals and reported performance information accurately reflects the extent to which the service is accomplishing its mission responsibilities. GAO found that the Coast Guard goals do not address all mission activities and that the service does not sufficiently report its performance goals and actual performance. In addition to recognizing the degree to which the Coast Guard is able to accomplish its missions today, it is also critical that the committee understands how the service plans to do so in the future. The capital investment plan is supposed to reflect the capital investments necessary to meet mission requirements in the future. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard submits the SIP late every year, precluding its use to properly inform appropriation and authorization legislation. When a SIP is finally delivered, its profile often does not align with the needs of the service as reported by the Commandant and other senior leaders. The Coast Guard says it needs new cutters and aircraft, yet the SIP contains outdated information that does not include funding to match those stated needs. As a glaring example, despite an over $1.5 billion funding shortfall to build and maintain shore infrastructure, the Coast Guard requests only nominal funding, $10 million. So I'll say it again, $1.5 billion, as stated by the Commandant and other senior leaders, and the Coast Guard requested $10 million in 2018 and $30 million for fiscal year 2019 for shore infrastructure projects. Rather than providing the information necessary to understand and support service priorities, the Coast Guard relies on Congress to set those priorities by appropriating funding above the requested levels. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard has failed to adjust acquisition documents to reflect the funding for additional assets, lessening the reliability and value of the information provided in the SIP. The Coast Guard's failure to ensure SIP investment levels accurately reflect its mission requirements and prior appropriations leave Congress without reliable information on which to base future appropriations and perform proper oversight. One Coast Guard mission area on which Congress has provided significant direction is commercial fishing and vessel safety. Congressional requirements regarding the construction and maintenance of commercial fishing vessels were enacted in 1988 and expanded in 2010, 12, and 16. In addition, Congress directed the Coast Guard to implement regulations regarding vessel classification requirements and establish alternate safety compliance programs to allow smaller and older vessels to comply with requirements more suited to their unique characteristics. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard has failed to act on those directives. Instead, in 2016, the Coast Guard developed an, quote, enhanced oversight program using existing policies and authorities focusing on older non-class fishing vessels that may have had an increased risk of vessel and crew loss. At the same time, the committee heard concerns from the commercial fishing industry regarding the lack of communication from the Coast Guard on the development of required alternate safety compliance programs. The enhanced oversight program did not alleviate those concerns due to questions about the program being permanent or temporary, and if temporary, whether the Coast Guard would work with industry to develop the alternate safety compliance programs required by law. GAO reviewed the Coast Guard's implementation of commercial fishing vessel classification requirements and its impact on new vessel construction and will provide testimony on their findings today. I look forward to hearing from the Coast Guard on where the service stands on implementing all of these requirements and more that I've mentioned. I thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing their thoughts on the issues. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've covered all of the issues that are before the committee and the concerns that the committee has. I would therefore like to for the record, put my statement in. It deals with not only the issues you raised, but some of the other things that are before us, which are probably not going to be taken up today because of the time element that we have. Without a doubt, for us to do our job of authorization as well as oversight, we need to have a solid foundation. Mr. Chairman, you went through that not only with the SIP, but also with the fishing vessel issue. So let's get on with it. My statement will be in the record for anybody that cares to search through the history.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Today we will hear testimony from Rear Admiral Linda Fagan, Deputy Commandant for Operations Policy and Capabilities, United States Coast Guard, and Mr. Nathan Anderson, Acting Director, Homeland Security and Justice Government Accountability Office. Rear Admiral Fagan, you are recognized to give your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Garamendi, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and ask that my written testimony please be accepted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you for the enduring support and trust of Congress and this subcommittee has provided to the United States Coast Guard. The recent supplemental appropriation for hurricane response allows the service to rebuild damaged infrastructure and remain resilient into the future. The Coast Guard is an integral part of many of these communities that suffer damage, and we were also impacted, as were the communities, and are committed to continuing to execute our missions in these regions. The Coast Guard operates in an increasingly complex world and strives to make the best use of the limited resources we have at our disposal. Through a deliberate approach known as the Standard Operational Planning Process, we continuously evaluate maritime threats and opportunities and develop plans to achieve mission success. Using national, departmental, service strategies as guideposts, we leverage the intelligence community and this planning process to employ a risk-based approach to prioritize assets where they are needed most. Tactical commanders benefit from this process and have the flexibility to allocate resources on scene, ultimately allowing us to address maritime threats with the greatest precision and effect. The planning process is guided by an annual strategic review to assess performance with robust metrics, identify operational gaps, and delineate steps needed to close them. We are appreciative of the GAO's recent review of the performance assessment system, and we are working to incorporate the recommendations of continual improvement in this regard. And the agility of this system was applied during the hurricane responses this past summer, when we mobilized and deployed nearly 3,000 members and helped rescue over 11,000 people in need. The performance measures we will discuss today are a result of a responsive, transparent, repeatable planning process. We shouldn't lose sight of the danger these measures reflect to our men and women who conduct frontline operations. And the decisions we make based on these metrics drive operational change in the field that affect our Coast Guard members. These are not just members, they're both public and Coast Guard lives on the line in these mission sets. And this risk is always present with me as I work on policy and resourcing here in Washington, and I'd like to share with you a story of how the system has impacted just myself personally. And my daughter is a junior officer serving on one of our legacy cutters, a 210-foot cutter. It's 53 years old, out of Port Angeles, Washington. And this past October, the Active was deployed into the Eastern Pacific in support of our Western Hemisphere strategy. An aircraft detected two pangas that appeared to be engaged in illicit activity. 3 o'clock in the morning, the Coast Guard Cutter Active launched their small boat to intercept and interdict the two pangas. One panga remained stationary, but the other fled with contraband on board, and the cutter's small boat gave chase. High-speed chase as the smugglers were discharging contraband overboard. In the darkness and at high speed, the cutter small boat and the panga collided. Following the collision, the panga swiftly surrendered, and the Active's crew successfully apprehended the smugglers and more than 800 kilograms of cocaine. Thankfully, no one was hurt in the incident, but for me and for all of us, the case is symbolic of the operations that the service undertakes 24/7, 365, and highlights the risk our men and women face in efforts to secure our borders, stop criminals, and save lives. The Active was directed to the Eastern Pacific as a result of this operational planning system, and our Western Hemisphere strategy provided the framework for operations. And intelligence helped showcase the threat in this particular asset. And it was an operational commander that directed my daughter's ship to face this dangerous mission set. The Coast Guard's strategic planning process works. History's proven that it's a responsive, capable, and agile Coast Guard using a deliberate planning process is indispensable instrument of national security. To protect American security and economic interests, the Coast Guard continues to improve its strategic planning system. We look forward to continue to invest smartly in capabilities, maintain our technological edge, recruit, develop, and retain a highly capable workforce in order to succeed in this increasingly complex environment. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Anderson, I understand this is your first time.
Yes, sir.
Good. Go ahead.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee, good afternoon. My testimony today is primarily based on work we've conducted over the past few years. I will address Coast Guard actions needed to improve the quality of data used for program management and improve the transparency of information used for reporting on its mission performance and capital planning. With regard to data quality, we have issued 3 reports over the past 2 years which underscore the need to collect and use quality data to make informed decisions. Our recent report on commercial fishing vessel safety illustrates the need for the Coast Guard to improve the completeness of mission data. Commercial fishing has one of the highest death rates of any industry in the United States. Vessel disasters are the leading cause of fatalities among fishers. Although the Coast Guard investigates these incidents, we found that rates of accidents, injuries, and fatalities involving commercial fishing vessels cannot be determined. Reliable data are either not maintained or are not collected by the Coast Guard or other federal agencies. Having this information could be useful to carrying out the Coast Guard's marine safety mission. The Coast Guard reported that it is taking some actions to address our recommendations, and we will continue to monitor these actions. Our review of Coast Guard strategic planning illustrates the need for the Coast Guard to also use data on actual asset performance to inform its allocations of assets to field units. We found that the Coast Guard's strategic allocations of assets were based on unrealistic assumptions about the asset performance capacities. They also did not take into account actual asset condition or maintenance needs. For example, the Coast Guard operates cutters that are 40 to 50 years old. These cutters are hampered by mechanical problems requiring emergency dry dock repairs, which results in reduced availability to carry out their missions. Officials from one field unit told us that they had planned for 575 hours per vessel per year for one type of cutter, in contrast to the headquarters' assumption of 825 hours performance capacity for the same asset. As a result, direction from headquarters, which was based on asset performance capacity, rather than actual performance hours, did not provide the field with realistic goals for allocating assets by mission. Now, our review of Coast Guard performance information illustrates the need for the Coast Guard to also improve the data it uses for establishing its performance goals. For example, the Coast Guard has 2 performance goals related to its drug interdiction mission. While the 2 goals capture performance data related to cocaine, they do not capture performance data for any other illegal drugs that the Coast Guard interdicts. We and others, including the DHS Inspector General, have reported on the need for measures to accurately assess progress toward achieving desired outcomes. We recommended that the Coast Guard develop additional goals to address mission activity gaps or explain why certain aspects of mission performance are measured while others are not. Let me now turn to the issue of transparency. Our recent reports have identified areas in which the Coast Guard could improve transparency of information used for capital planning. For example, our work on Coast Guard's annual 5-year capital investment plan found that the plan does not consistently show the effects of trade-offs that are made as part of the annual budget cycle. This could make it difficult for the Coast Guard to afford its planned program of record. In 2014, we recommended developing a 20-year plan that identifies all necessary recapitalization efforts and any fiscal resources likely necessary to build these assets. In our recent work, we have continued to emphasize the importance of this type of capital planning. The Coast Guard generally concurred with our recommendations and is in various stages of implementing them. For example, in 2016, the Coast Guard revised its mission needs statement. This statement provides a basic foundation for the long-term investment planning that is to serve as the basis for evaluating the effectiveness of various fleet mixes. However, the 2016 mission needs statement did not identify specific assets the Coast Guard needs to achieve its missions. It also did not update the annual hours the Coast Guard needs from each asset class to complete its missions. It is unclear when the 20-year plan will be completed, but its analysis could serve as a foundation for understanding potential trade-offs that could be made across the Coast Guard's portfolio of acquisitions to better meet mission needs within realistic funding levels. Such an analysis would facilitate a fuller understanding of the affordability challenges facing the Coast Guard. In closing, our work has found that the Coast Guard can do more in terms of collecting, using, and improving the transparency of information to help meet its missions. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Admiral, let's start here. I want to make it clear so you know what this hearing's about. It's about the implementation of Coast Guard programs. This isn't about whether the Coast Guard does its job or not, because the Coast Guard does its job. It's not about the Coast Guardsmen not taking risks, because they take risks every day in defense of this nation. You have 11 statutory missions. We're not talking about that at all. We're talking about things like this, and we'll start with this one. The Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2010 required the following for seamen's shoreside access. Do you know what that means? Seamen's shoreside access?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do.
Okay, I'll read it for the record here. Each facility security plan approved under Section 70103C of Title 46 U.S. Code shall provide a system for seamen assigned to a vessel at that facility to board and depart the vessel through this facility in a timely manner at no cost to the individual. That was 2010. In 2015, every year since 2015, which is 5 years after 2010, the Coast Guard has said that the Seafarer Access Final Rule will be issued in the near future. Is it issued?
No, Mr. Chairman. The final rule is with the administration, and I'm happy to provide a detailed brief once it's clear, but it is in clearance with the administration.
So I'll just add these up. That's 8 years. Let's go on to the next one. Between 2013 and 2017, Congress appropriated over $2 billion more for acquisitions than the Coast Guard requested in order to meet emerging needs and appropriately position the service to meet all the mission demands. For the past 5 budget cycles, that's 10 years, Congress has appropriated $2 billion more for Coast Guard acquisitions than was requested. Why is that? That's 10 years, 5 budget cycles, or is that 5 years? Am I thinking terms or years?
5 years.
5 years. Sorry, so we'll just go 8. There's 5.
So, sir, I'm not sure I completely understand.
So here, let me phrase it easier. Congress gives you more than you ask for, knowing what you need somehow better than you know. And that's where the GAO metrics come in. And what I'm learning this year in the Department of Defense and all the different acquisition changes that we're doing, the metrics that you're using, whether it's that you dotted the I's or crossed your T's or did every process point that you were supposed to do, your outcomes are what we want to measure. And we want to measure your time outcomes as well. Your time metrics are horrible. I mean, if this was an F-35 being built or boats being built, which you went through, boats being built with no actual boats in the end being built, but spending billions of dollars, that's what this is coming from. There are no metrics for us, for GAO, or for the public to see that you're accomplishing what you're telling us you're going to be accomplishing in the future. And go ahead and tell us why you don't request the $2 billion for the last 5 years that we've added on so to make sure that you can do your jobs.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to talk to how we do utilize metrics, and I talked in my opening remarks about the operational planning process that we use for a repeatable, recurring, predictable process that allows us to make resourcing decisions and resource allocations against the 11 statutory missions. It's a key part of iterating and continuing to improve. We absolutely engage with the budget process, understand the important oversight role that this committee plays in ensuring that the Coast Guard is properly budgeted and resourced.
I don't understand. Why is it $2 billion short every year when we give you the $2 billion that you need, and you spend all of it? I mean, you don't say we don't need that, and there's $2 billion left over every year, right?
Yes, sir. And the Commandant has testified and has been very consistent in the need for a stable, recurring $2 billion SIP, 5% annualized O&M growth, and the need to begin having stable and recurring money, $300 million a year, to begin to buy back some of the shoreside backlog that the service currently has. And we certainly appreciate all of the support that the administration and this committee has given us in ensuring that we are resourced in a manner that helps us continue to meet our mission needs and requirements.
Okay, so we'll hit SIP here last. It's always late. And from what I was looking through and reading the materials up to this, it looks like the life cycle cost estimates are always off. The last SIP you had for the NSCs didn't even have the new NSCs on it, the ones that were appropriated for that the Senate put in, the extra NSC. If you could speak to the SIP, is it the process within the Coast Guard it's all fouled up so it's not able to be done on time for the President's budget request and for our authorization process for the Coast Guard bill? I mean, what is the problem? And we'll help.
So, yes, sir. I acknowledge that the SIP, the FY19 SIP, is late. We are as anxious to deliver the SIP to the committee and our overseers as you are to receive it. I assure you that it is a critical document to us as it is to you, and we are working with due diligence and a sense of urgency to complete that document. So the bad news is it's late. I acknowledge that. We are working to be responsive and deliver it to this committee, sir. The good news is when the SIP is delivered, some of the life cycle cost estimates, particularly with regard to the NSC, will have been updated and revised, and I think you'll be pleased to see that progress, sir. And
hopefully it'll be 2018 and not 2016 or 17.
Yes, sir. I'm hopeful that we will deliver the FY 19 SIP shortly, sir.
Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Your line of questions raises a significant problem for us in that we're given information about what the Coast Guard wants, and it's significantly different from what we anticipate the Coast Guard needs. And you were referring to the couple $2 billion annually. I'd like to go into the process a little more deeply here. The budgeting process generally begins with OMB sending the various departments its expectations, that is OMB's expectations for the coming year. You then have a pass back, and OMB then checks that out, and then that eventually becomes the President's budget. Is that essentially what happens here?
Yes, sir.
I thought so. So the question is, in answer to the question, is it an answer to the Chairman's question that the problem begins with OMB sending the Coast Guard a minimum amount of a minimum budget that doesn't reflect what we perceive the needs of the Coast Guard to be? Is that, and I'm not sure you want to answer that. Let me just make that a statement. My recollection when I was at the Department of Interior, that's how it works. And so there's a constant tension back and forth. What we need, therefore, is at the end of our process to have a clarity over the 5-year period as to what is expected, what we expect the Coast Guard to do that is consistent with our authorization. Can the Coast Guard provide that information to us without OMB sidetracking the data?
We engage in the budget process as you have outlined it, sir. We are working with a sense of urgency and diligence to deliver that 5-year outlook to the committee. We understand how critical it is for the oversight and investment decisions that need to be made, and we are fully engaged with the budgetary process, sir.
Perhaps a way that we could address this issue is that at the conclusion of our annual or semi-annual authorization for the Coast Guard, we have authorized a plan. Certain number of ships for this class or that class, certain number of personnel and so forth for the out years. And perhaps maybe the answer here is for us to require the Coast Guard to report its progress in the authorization that we have provided in the most recent reauthorization of the Coast Guard functions. Could the Coast Guard do that without OMB screwing up the numbers? I should not add that last clause to it.
So,
let me just say, could the Coast Guard report back on its progress in meeting the authorized activities?
So, sir, we would absolutely be responsive to the desire to understand how the authorizations have been executed.
Yeah. I think that may be a way of having the Coast Guard be responsive to the authorization rather than responsive to the annual instructions from OMB. So I'll just let that hang out there and consider that myself and perhaps with the chairman and staff that might be a way we can be up to date and require that the Coast Guard at least be responsive to what we have authorized to be done, recognizing that we're not the only player in the game. Certainly the President and the administration are, as they allocate in their minds the resources of the nation. Just generally, Mr. Anderson, it appears as though your report indicates that the Coast Guard is making steps to, and progress, in answering the performance questions that GAO has raised over the years. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, and I'd like to applaud the Coast Guard for concurring with virtually all of our recommendations on improving data quality in the context of performance goals. I would also like to note that the Coast Guard routinely develops corrective actions and articulates those corrective actions when a goal is unmet. They put these corrective actions into the APR, and we applaud them for that. I think our points on the corrective action score in terms of those unmet goals is some of the corrective actions aren't measurable or time-bound, and those are criteria that we would like to see for full closure of those recommendations.
Okay. Before the chairman disciplines me, I will yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Weber, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Fagan, a couple of questions for you. Does the administration get periodic updates, or do they just, when the OMB, when y'all come in for a request, does the OMB just get it once a year and look at it?
So again, sir, we fully engage in the budget process at all of the multiple steps and endeavor to be responsive to each of the pieces in the process as the president's budget is developed.
So is there someone who interacts with the White House kind of on a periodic basis, or is it just you walk in there and present a budget proposal to them?
We have a budget shop within the Coast Guard that engages the department and the administration and entities as other organizations do as the budget process is developed.
Okay. Of course, you know about the annual report that says if your stated goals were modified to address mission activity gaps, quote unquote, is that addressed periodically, or is that something y'all report with the GAO, back to GAO on an annual basis? Or do they monitor? Maybe that's a question from Mr. Anderson. Do you monitor that periodically?
We monitor that when we have ongoing engagements, looking at that within the scope of our work for Congress. So as that comes up in our ongoing engagements, that would be something that would be reportable. Okay.
And Admiral Fagan, do you agree with that assessment? Do y'all have that kind of dialogue periodically?
I do. There's with regard to measures and again the operational planning process that we utilize. It very much is an ongoing iterative discussion. We work with the department, with GAO. The goal is to be better at the end of each cycle than we were when we started it.
So they've stated that you have mission activity gaps. Do you get, test is not the right word, but do you monitor that? Do you come back and say, here's how you can address that gap and how you can do it better? Do y'all have that kind of interaction on a periodic basis?
Where there are gaps, there is a very healthy discussion of what the gaps are, how to make it the measure more reflective of performance in the mission set. Oh. And again, very much a ongoing and continuing conversation so that we have the best, most reflective measures of performance available to our overseers and to the public.
Other than not calling y'all in here to testify to too many hearings, how can Congress help y'all make that goal? In other words, close those gaps. How can we help you do that?
So generally, sometimes the gaps are a result of how the performance measure is framed. Others can be a result of not being the only entity that controls an outcome. Congress has been exceptionally supportive of the Coast Guard and of helping us to ensure that we are best meeting those performance metrics and measures. And we look forward to continuing an open and continuing a dialogue with our overseers and with the other governmental agencies that share that same.
Well, and we appreciate that. Vice Admiral Carl Schultz came to my district in Texas, the 3 coastal counties, after Hurricane Harvey, and just did the Coast Guard just did an absolute yeoman's job, and I'm not even sure that's accurate enough. So we appreciate that. Would you give us any suggestions, Admiral, as to, I've got about a minute left, how else we could help you?
Sir, this committee in Congress has been exceptionally supportive. We absolutely are committed to providing the information the committee has asked for to enable the oversight and resourcing conversation that is so critical to the success we achieved in Texas this past summer and the ongoing successes in the mission sets around the country, sir. Thank you.
So, well, you betcha. All right, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I think what you've done, you've actually beat us down. We know if we require more reports from you, we just won't get them in the future, so we won't ask for any. Ms. Plaskett is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I want to just let everyone know how incredibly pleased and grateful I am to be here on this subcommittee and to have my first subcommittee hearing with Admiral Fagan. Thank you so much for all that you and your men and women of the Coast Guard did for the Virgin Islands. I've been grateful for you even bringing me back home once or twice on some of your vessels as I was trying to make my way back home during the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. So the people of the Virgin Islands are enormously grateful to you all for the work that you have done and continue to do on our islands. You know, when I was looking at the GAO report, one of the things that I noted was a discussion about the use of more realistic asset performance data. And they said that they reported that the Coast Guard's strategic allocation of assets were based on unrealistic assumptions about the performance capacity of its assets and did not reflect asset conditions and unscheduled maintenance. Can you talk just briefly about what your assessment of that portion of the report means?
So we continually evaluate what type of performance and effect we would be able to achieve with the assets that we have assigned, and the measures, the performance measures that we use for the different asset types sometimes have served us well. There are some areas GAO has pointed out, and we're looking at how to refine those measures to best reflect how the resources are able to perform in the mission set.
Well, to me, in a best case for the Coast Guard scenario, what this appears to me to mean is that you're trying to outperform yourself on assets and with material that doesn't meet the needs of what you all would like to do, that you are pushing your people and maybe performing in a manner that outperforms antiquated or old. You know, when they talk about unscheduled maintenance and the need for cutters that were 50 years old and the cutters were hampered by mechanical failure requirements, if in fact you had the assets that you needed and were in the best case scenario in terms of your budget allocations and the budgets that we have given you, then you would be able to perform more effectively. You know, as a parent, that's what I would tell if my kid got a bad grade and they said that about me. What do you think?
So thank you. Which is why we've undertaken the significant recapitalization that we have of the Coast Guard. The legacy assets do experience increased maintenance days, and then those are days that they are not employed in against the mission set. So the quicker we're able to bring the new assets online, I'll use, for example, particularly in the Virgin Islands and the Caribbean, the fast response cutters that are being deployed into that region are being deployed for great effect against some of the threats and the mission set, and are experiencing some significant success.
But as you talk about the fast cutters that are being used, I know, in the Virgin Islands, how is that, the effectiveness of that in comparison to the use of national security cutters or offshore patrol cutters, or having a larger amount of cutters to be able to meet the needs of what you see as the national security threats in that region?
So the new modernized cutters, national security cutters, operational, the OPCs and the FRCs are incredibly capable assets that with other force packages, aircraft and small boats, increase the effect that we're able to achieve in the mission sets. They are, you know, a national security cutter, a day afloat on a national security cutter provides a much larger impact than that same day afloat on a legacy 378-foot.
Thank you. And just in closing, do you have any report on the status of the Coast Guard marine debris removal operations? I know that, you know, in the state, there's been recent Washington Post articles about the state of debris removal in the Virgin Islands, and I know a lot of that is the Army Corps of Engineers. But has the Coast Guard been deployed to assist in moving those things directly off the island and are facing regarding these activities within the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as well? Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, thank you very much for being here. First issue, in August of 2016, the Coast Guard proposed a final rule for TWIC card readers at certain facilities adjacent to waterways. We had strong concerns that we spoke about in this committee room. We had subsequent follow-up meetings with the Coast Guard on that, and we are seeing inconsistent guidance coming out of the Coast Guard to some of these facilities. And just to give you a little background, I think you know this, but you have a number of facilities that may have maritime access or maritime component, but that can be a very minor component of a much larger facility. Yet you are requiring TWIC card readers at the entire facility. These can be costly. Some of the information or guidance on securing some of the private information related to this has not been provided to some of these facilities. And I'll say it again, that the Coast Guard indicated to us in this room and indicated to us in meetings that this would be delayed and sort of probably some stakeholder engagement, maybe looking at some tweaks to it. So now we're in a situation where August of this year is implementation. All these facilities have been operating under the assumption for the last several months that there was going to be some type of change or revoking this rule while folks thought through it a little bit more. And now we're getting inconsistent guidance on whether or not this is going to actually apply in 2018 of this year. Can you give me a little bit of an update on what we should be telling our constituents?
Yes, thank you.
Would you mind going close to the microphone?
I'm sorry, sir. The Coast Guard is working in support of DHS, who's the regulatory lead on the effort. We are well aware of the confusion that when the final rule was published this summer with regard to extent of applicability, and particularly the concern no opportunity to comment. And so we are working with DHS to ensure that we provide that the clarity that's been sought by your constituents.
All right, so it's March now. We're talking about August. That's 5 months, and some of these potential changes to comply with the rule, candidly, would probably take a year of construction. In some cases, maybe even longer. These are, and I know you're aware, we have all these chemical facilities along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, one of the largest industrial corridors in the world, and all of them have been operating under the assumption that this was going to be pulled back because that was the signal that we were all given. And so we have strong concerns with the certainty and the ability of these facilities to even comply. And again, we really need to know what to tell them to do at this point. I don't think it's fair, quite frankly, to come in and say, well, no, actually, we're going to leave it in place as it was before, because I think we all acknowledge that the ability to comply with it probably was a little bit too challenging for some facilities based on how they're laid out. I'm really just looking for some guidance on what we're supposed to tell them, and what would you do if you were a plant or some other type of facility adjacent to one of these waterways right now?
Yes, sir. I understand the need for clarity. Again, we're working within the rulemaking process at DHS diligently to provide better clarity and certainly for certainty for the entities impacted by that rulemaking, sir.
All right. Well, I'm going to say it one more time that you can't comply with it at this point. You can't. Most of these places don't have enough time, And if this is a problem at DHS or somewhere else, I really would appreciate you all helping us identify where the challenge is, because it's just not fair. There was an opportunity for stakeholder input, and it's not fair at this point to come back and say, well, we're just going to leave the previous rule in place and apply in 5 months. So I appreciate you taking that back. If you want to talk to us offline about where we should be directing our phone calls or other things, I'd appreciate that. The FY19 budget has approximately $720 million in it for 3 heavies. And I understand that last week they went out for an RFP on design and construction. Can you talk a little bit about what your expectation is for timeline moving forward on when those would actually be operational, and just some type of Gantt chart on what we're looking at moving to the right?
Yes, on Friday we did release the RFP broadly, looking for resource proposals for beginning construction of a heavy icebreaker. The Gantt chart moving forward is hopeful that the first heavy is delivered 2023, with then out year delivery of additional hulls. We used industry studies as a best practice to help in development of those RFPs, and as a means to just help accelerate the quality of the design and the time frame moving forward. And we are standing by and ready to execute when additional monies are appropriated.
All right, so first hull 2023, the next 2 obviously to the right of that, and you think things stay on schedule right now, and anticipate funding obviously in the out years to keep this thing going?
Yes, sir. We've never been closer to a heavier icebreaker. Having a heavy icebreaker as a nation, it's critical. My first assignment 35 years ago was on the Polar Star. I'm well aware of the absolute criticality and national security need of replacing that vessel, and I'm confident we're on a positive timeline, sir.
They're not paying attention, so I'm going to keep talking. Can I keep going? Is that all right? Oh, come on. You know what, Mr. Garamendi, y'all go so far over. I sat here and watched y'all like in 20 minutes since in the red. So y'all just keep talking. Y'all are good. 3 mediums. The budget, I'm sorry. I'm going to talk about 3 mediums, then talk about another issue in the budget. Can you talk about 3 mediums and sort of just what you expect timeline on that, and a little bit about operations and again, delivery on something on 3 mediums?
So the priority is the heavy icebreaker. We're focused right now on opening the delivery and product line on the heavy icebreakers, and the medium becomes part of those out year conversations as we bring the first heavy.
Am I correct in recalling, though, that y'all did identify the requirements for 3 mediums as well?
Yes, sir. 3 heavies, 3 mediums.
Okay, and so you're focusing on the 3 heavies, and obviously there's going to be significant cost in those. The mediums, you're expecting further right, so you're expecting all 3 heavy hull deliveries, then moving to mediums. Do you expect any concurrent?
So there is the exact time frame, and the mediums moving forward are very much part of the ongoing just discussions. Focus absolutely is on the heavies, and then we'll look to leverage what we can from the heavy icebreaker.
Okay, I think I can speak for Mr. Hunter, Mr. Garamendi on this. I'm not sure that Congresswoman Plaskett cares about icebreakers in the Virgin Islands, maybe, but as you know, the comparison of U.S. capabilities to other Arctic nations, we're significantly further behind where we are. You have a number of advocates here to ensure that we have the capabilities we need to address many missions of this government, and just want to urge you to keep that on the front burner. Last issue, the Waterways Commerce Cutter. I think there's $5 million in FY19 budget for that. Just curious if you can just very quickly, again, give us a summary of what you expect that to look like moving to the right.
Yes, sir. There is money in the budget for the Waterways Commerce Cutter. We, again, primary focus with regard to the next major project is the heavy icebreaker, but very much beginning requirements development and the work that marches us forward with regard to acquisition and replacement on the Waterways Commerce Cutter. That timeline as well will resolve itself, but again, a sense of urgency, again, in another major recapitalization need.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield back all of my remaining time to Mr. Garamendi.
You owe us now. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized for further statements or questions.
Given the extraordinary response of the Coast Guard to the hurricanes, I would expect that this year's metrics are not going to meet what was anticipated. And unintended or unanticipated events will undoubtedly modify those metrics. And so in the reporting to us and to the GAO, how can this be taken into account by simply noting that we had 2,000 personnel that were doing things other than chasing drugs in the Caribbean. They were chasing survivors. Does that work? Does that fit for the GAO and how you might respond?
So you very accurately identified the opportunity cost to the organization associated with the responses this summer. How those are accounted for and the impacts on the performance metrics and measures will be part of the operational planning process and in our internal look, the repeatable, reliable process. I am not an expert on how we will do that bookkeeping, but I would expect that there will be some adjustment that reflects the significant level of effort expended by boats and assets and cutters against the disasters this past summer.
And I suppose, GAO, as you do your reviews, you take these things into account.
Absolutely. Our October 2017 report that did focus on the goals and the reasons for unmet goals did highlight, I think, 7 case studies where we took a look at performance goals that kind of crossed a variety of missions, and we unpacked some of the meaning behind why goals weren't met. We'd just like to point out, though, that your question does underscore something very important about the handful of reports that we've used to backstop this testimony statement, and that is, good data is needed for good allocation of assets. And we've pointed out several times where there is a bit of a mismatch between the actual use and the assumed use of a handful of assets, which could limit the ability of the Coast Guard to surge. So bringing this back to our central message, the better data that are available on actual asset use will provide a clearer picture for the Coast Guard to then reallocate when there are unanticipated events.
Okay. Thank you. One of the results of the hurricanes was a significant loss of property assets, Coast Guard assets, and we have approved a budget for the replacement of those assets or the replacement improvements and whatever other maintenance might be required to the tune, I think, of something less than $1 billion. Here's where I want to go with this question is, and I'm going to use this for the other programs of record that are out there, and that is that it's important to me, and I believe to this committee, that we have a continuing update, not every month, perhaps not every other month, but maybe on a 6-month cycle on the progress of these major programs. Mr. Graves spoke at length on things that are really not his turf, that is our turf, my turf, Chairman's turf. We call that our icebreakers, not Graves' icebreakers. But we'll get over that, and we'll deal with that personally here. But he raises a very, very important point. What is the progress? How is it going? What problems have you encountered in the design, the money, the contracting and the like, and then carrying on to the other light icebreakers, other heavies and other lights? We need to know that. And so for all of the major programs that you have underway, the offshore patrol cutters, the other various capital programs that you have, and now the follow-up on the hurricane repairs, these are important things for us to keep track of for 2 reasons. One, we may want to modify the program of record, or we may want to cancel or augment. And we can't do that unless we know where you are in the process. Now, I understand you do this occasionally, but not in a periodic way, so that, let's say, every 6 months, where are you with the, I think it's fast response cutters that are built in Mr. Graves' district? Where are you with the offshore patrol? All of those things. Where are you periodically along the line so that we can say, oh my, there's a problem that comes about for whatever reason, and then we can address it or not, or encourage you to address it. Is that a sensible way for us to keep track of where we are in these programs that we have laid out for the Coast Guard to do? And can you do it?
We very much do what you've described with regard to program management and oversight of our major acquisitions. You know, any one of which you've named. It is a regular, recurring, very senior leadership driven review. We are responsible to DHS as well, and so the process is there, and the extent that we can and should share information with our overseers. I'm confident we've got a well-developed ongoing process with regard to ensuring that we are responsibly and transparently and reliably spending the resources that are generously allocated to it.
So internally it's being done? Yes, on sir. These major programs, and I suppose on the other, the 11 specific tasks that you're required to carry out, search, rescue, so on and so forth, drug interdiction and the like. I'm going to work with the chairman and see if there's some way that we could receive just a periodic review of that. Much of the GAO report appears to me to be one of setting up systems of metrics so that the Coast Guard knows where it is on all of these tasks that it has to do, that there's a methodology of reporting so many sailors doing, so many coasties doing whatever they're supposed to be doing, so much drug interdiction, so much work on boating accidents and so forth. And that seems to me to be useful internally for the Coast Guard to keep track of where it is and what it's supposed to be doing. For us, we have somewhat different task. We'll be looking at the larger picture, reviewing particularly where the big money is going, where the big tasks are going, and if we can set up some sort of a repetitious, not every month, maybe every 6 months, but certainly no less than every year, where we are reviewing, okay, where are you on the icebreakers? Which probably will be like once every other month because of the way in which it is now gearing up. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I'd like to see if we have some way we can keep track of that. Right now, it's hit and miss, depending upon when we are able to call a hearing. And maybe we're asking for it, maybe we're not. But just as a way of keeping track of where we are on these major programs would be useful as I look at what the Coast Guard is responsible to do. With regard to the annual budgeting and so forth, I understand OMB and I understand all the games that you have to play there, and I understand that you really don't control your budget and that the Department of Homeland Security is probably ripping your budget off to build something, maybe a wall, I don't know. But whatever, we understand you don't control all of that. We can if we have knowledge and information. So thank you. I'll let it hang out there.
Thank the gentleman. I'm just going to, that's a great question if you could track the icebreaker progress. But if you can't do the SIP and everything else is late and your internal metrics and targets don't match your external outside-in metrics, I think it's a futile thing to ask you to report to us because you'll just be late and say we're working on it. And it's important to us and we're working on it. But we can talk about that. Mr. Anderson, let's go here. We're talking about DHS. Is it DHS's prohibition on the Coast Guard that does not allow them to release a full annual performance report?
I believe that would be a better question for the Coast Guard witness.
So, Mr. Chairman, with previous negotiations with DHS with regard to releasing the full report, the preference was for partial reporting within the totality of the DHS report. We have every intent this year and are very close to publishing the full performance measures report. And I'm confident that here quite soon that will be publicly available. The total report will be fully published.
Does the Coast Guard feel that it's being asked to record too many metrics, too many things that don't have anything to do with the outcome of your 11 missions?
The performance measures report and the process that we use to look at those measures and evaluate our performance and effectiveness are part of the process, the annualized, repeatable process, and are absolutely critical and essential to us continually evaluating how we're performing and how.
But it can't be that essential because a lot of these reports are late.
So are you referring to the performance report, sir?
No, SIP. But I'm just saying these are all things that are due. These are all things that inform you about your progress and what you need and how much money you need and how well the Coast Guard's doing. If they're not on time, like the SIP, how do you use that to inform yourselves?
So, sir, we are absolutely committed to delivering the SIP. Acknowledge that we're late on the deliverable, but that document is as valuable to us as it is to you, and we are committed to getting it to the committee as soon as possible, sir.
Answer this, Mr. Anderson. How does the service's 11 statutory missions align with the DHS goals for the Coast Guard?
Well, in our recent review, we found there were 37 goals, 37 performance goals that are meant to align with the 11 statutory missions. Those goals either fully or partially aligned with the statutory missions. Where there wasn't perfect alignment, we did recommend that the Coast Guard identify our new goals needed, or alternatively explain to Congress and to others why these proxy goals, kind of fit the bill. One example here is on drug interdiction. Coast Guard uses cocaine as a proxy. That doesn't kind of reflect the entire suite of drug interdiction activities or all the narcotics that the Coast Guard ultimately interdicts. So we asked the Coast Guard.
Wait, what you're saying is they have metrics for coke, but not marijuana or heroin or whatever.
Yeah, reportable metrics. The Coast Guard does.
They obviously have metrics on how much weed they interdict every year.
Yes,
right?
they do.
They just don't give that to you?
They don't give that to you.
Gotcha. Why is that?
That would also be a better question for the Coast Guard.
Okay, Admiral. Why would it affect is this just an oversight or?
So we do use, in cocaine volume, cocaine interdiction is one of our key metrics within the counter-narcotics mission set. We acknowledge that there are.
Is that because it is the most expensive drug out there or most prevalent on the high seas or what?
It's the metric we're currently using, sir. We acknowledge that there are other indicators that would perhaps be better indicators of performance in the mission set. We are very much, we look forward to having that conversation with GAOs.
But you keep track of that.
We do track interdictions, detainees, yes, sir.
You just don't, okay, so just help clear this up. Why don't you give it to us?
I guess I was not aware that we weren't sharing that information.
Okay.
We do track that. I think that we do track that, sir.
Okay, thank you. That's really all I have, unless Mr. Garamendi or the other members here. Ms. Plaskett, you're recognized.
Sure, thank you.
We're always happy to have somebody else chime in besides me and John.
Anytime. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions regarding commercial fishing classification. The classification standards that apply to virtually every other class of commercial vessels, in general, these standards have improved greatly the overall safety record of commercial vessels. Mr. Anderson, does the GAO agree that classified standards improve the safety of the commercial vessels?
Well, that's an area that where we don't believe data exists. When we performed our performance evaluation, I think that was one of the key takeaways was that the Coast Guard needs data to really inform classing guidance, but also to determine if data show that classing has a positive effect on safety. So this is where there's a paucity of data.
So it may not, it may or may not. You're still looking for the data to make that determination?
Yes, we believe, we ultimately recommended that a working group be formed to go get data such as that, because we believe that first we need the data to determine whether or not that ends up having a positive effect on safety.
And why don't you have the data at this point?
Well, there are various entities that ultimately collect the data. Coast Guard collects some, other federal agencies collect others, state regulators also collect some. Hence our recommendation for a working group to bring together those parties to kind of combine the data that do exist to basically put the Coast Guard in the position of having a denominator. Right now it essentially has a numerator.
So in your recommendation for this working group, you mentioned that the Coast Guard, NIOSH, National Marine Fisheries Services should form the working group. Do you think that other stakeholders, such as state organizations or industry representatives, should be in that working group as well?
Yes, we do believe that others should be in that working group, in large part, for the reasons I stated, that some of those entities have data that may not currently be available to the federal agencies.
Okay, and it's your recommendation as well that the Coast Guard issue regulations or guidance to clarify or implement that alternative safety compliance programs, which you referred to as alternative to class approach. Is it necessary to issue formal regulations, or would guidance be sufficient in this area?
Well, I think in this area there are some advantages to regulations. Regulations set up a formal process. The regulations also invite a number of different perspectives to the table, and it is time-bound. So I can see some advantages to the regulations route.
Now, were you also able to determine whether the regulations or guidance was helpful in less than commercial class vessels that the Coast Guard reviews?
I don't believe that was within the scope of that engagement.
Have you done it in the past, do you know?
I'd have to get back in touch with you with an answer for that one. I can talk to my subject matter experts back at GAO.
Okay, Admiral Fagan, do you know if that's been done in the reviewed in the past? The effectiveness and the efficacy of the regulations to safety of the Coast Guard having regulations or guidance on other vessels that are not commercial vessels. So I'm thinking in the Virgin Islands, we don't have large commercial vessels that ones think of specifically, but we do have smaller vessels that are constantly around the island, whether they're yachts or individuals going on excursions or even private boaters in the area. Have you looked at do you know if there are studies that determine the effectiveness of those guidelines versus regulations?
I'm not aware of a study that looks specifically at guidelines versus regulations. As we look at different types of vessels and the risk, use regulations and policy and voluntary safety systems, a whole host of tools to help bring better safety records and safety for the people that are operating those vessels.
Mm-hmm. Because I know while I don't mind, and I see the benefit to all coming on a lot of the vessels in the Virgin Islands for security reasons as well, not just safety of the vessel. I know that our weekend boaters going to Buck Island in particular, might have a different view of that. So having the data, I think, would be really important. And I think that GAO, as they looked into the implementation of the classification requirements, whether or not which ones are necessary and which ones are most effective, if that's been put in place as well.
The scope of that report was really on the need for more reliable data in these commercial fishing vessels. With your permission, I do have one of my experts here to assist if you would like an answer to that question specifically from one of my colleagues.
If you could give that to us afterwards, that would be helpful. Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Gilmore, you recognize me.
I want to, I think I'll do this for the record, but just to save some time here, it's a follow-up on what Ms. Paskett was talking about. And it's the fishing classification standards. We have that for the larger commercial vessels. They are in line with the IMO standards. I believe that we have exempted the smaller boats, smaller fishing boats. And the question is, from the experience of the Coast Guard, would we improve the life safety if the smaller boats were not exempted and had to meet higher standards, or perhaps the international commercial standards? We need to get into that. That's an issue that comes back here on a regular basis, and it'd be helpful to have some of the Coast Guard experience and advice on that issue. So I'll let that hang out there. I doubt that you'll have an answer right now, but we'll give it to you for the record. Chairman and I were just trying to figure out how we can stay on top of the activities, the major programs that the Coast Guard is responsible to carry out. There are 11 of them. Then there's all these new ships that you're building, cutters that you're building, aircraft that you're repurposing, the 27s and the like. You obviously have heard frustration about the SIP and the lateness of it. In a question that I asked a while ago, Admiral, you indicated that you do quarterly reviews, maybe more often than quarter, probably 6 months also, updates on how these major programs are going in the internal management of the Coast Guard. And I assume that's all the way up to the Commandant, sit around a table and say, what's happening with the 27s out in McClellan? We getting them done? We're not getting them done? What's the problem? To ameliorate the frustration that we have about the SIP, which seems to be not timely, presented to us in a timely way, I think we're going to, I'm going to suggest that we pursue a more informal but more often review of where we are on the major programs that we follow. There's a lot of money involved. They're critical to the future work of the ability of the Coast Guard to carry out its missions. If you have that internal information, I don't know if it needs to be edited, but it would surely be helpful to us to keep track of where we are and as we do our work on authorization and appropriations. Now, we're not the appropriating committee, but we do talk to them from time to time, and they should see things our way. And when they don't, we try to persuade them otherwise. But taken together, I think we'd be able to keep better track of where the Coast Guard is on its major programs and activities, and simultaneously be able to be of more immediate help when needed on whatever the problem might be. So I'm going to let that hang out there for your review, and someday over a cup of coffee, maybe we can pursue that. Do you think that would be helpful, Mr. Anderson?
Sorry, could you specify the part about which part would be helpful?
That it would be helpful to receive a, I don't know, let's say a quarterly or at least a semi-annual update on where the major programs are. The Coast Guard apparently does it internally.
I am aware that we provide similar service for other major programs and other departments where we do speak to the appropriators and authorizers on a routine basis, such as quarterly.
I thought you might. And it would be helpful, I think, for us in our oversight review. And we do, what, every other year or every year? Every other year? A reauthorization.
Oh, every
Yeah,
year.
every other year, a reauthorization. And the appropriations are annual. And so if we can be helpful with the appropriators, this kind of information is important. And maybe less formal, but maybe we'll just sit down with a cup of coffee and review where we are. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank the ranking member. In the end, too, I was looking at the your program baseline, the approved program baseline, which I assume informs the SIP, right, Admiral? So that your program baselines, which I imagine a bunch of bars on charts, informs your capital investment, your 5-year building plan, basically. But your baseline doesn't have C-130J, C-27, C-144s, the 9th NSC that we gave, or the 6 FRCs needed to replace the CENTCOM FRCs. if that's needed to inform your SIP, we might even be happy just seeing the program baselines that you have right now until the SIP is completed, whenever that may be. I'm not enthusiastic about seeing anything, frankly. There's, you know, on the Armed Services Committee, we do mean things, like take away Suburbans and airplanes from 4 stars when they don't get us the things that we require. We're going to make sure, too, that we're not overburdening you with reports. Otherwise, that's our fault. Last authorization, we gave you a whole section with the reports that we thought were important. We changed the structure, right? So now you have one section. We're going to go through that and look at those to make sure that you're not being overburdened and you're only reporting to us what you need to, so that those few things can be on time for once, ever. Lastly, with performance tracking, Mr. Anderson talked about how higher headquarters says 800 something hours, the guys actually driving the boat say 500 hours, and that leaves you with a 300 hours something gap. That doesn't help anybody. It really doesn't. And I'm just not sure why it's done that way. It's not done that way for any other service that I've seen. If your aircraft is this many years old and it has this many hours on it, here's so many years or hours we expect out of it, right? That's how it's normally done. It's not a top level thing where they say this is what it's supposed to do if it was brand new, and the people on the ground say, well, this is what it can actually do. Am I getting that right, Mr. Anderson?
Yes, you are. That report from about 2 years ago that we issued did say that there was a difference between what the field units knew could be used for a particular asset and the direction it was getting the strategic intent from headquarters. There was a delta there. It was about, for the example that you're citing, it was 575 hours versus 825 hours for a cutter. I
think in the end, Admiral, it looks like the Coast Guard is making things harder on itself by not using consistent metrics, by not aligning with DHS, and not aligning with us on this committee, so we can say, hey, your outcomes are great. Because if you look at your missions and you really delve into them, and you don't do the 800 hours versus 500 hours, but you look at your outcomes, right? Those things that we don't get all of, that GAO was talking about, that we would like to start getting. If you look at those, you're successful. So it looks to me like it's a problem between point A and point Z. You're getting to point Z and doing a great job. Point A sounds good, but everything in between, it's not matching up, and it's providing us with trouble, and it's providing you with trouble, and it's providing GAO with trouble, and probably DHS with trouble too. So we'll look through this and see what we can do to assist you to cut down on the reports you have to do that aren't necessary, and to require the reports that we need. It's only a few of them, because we're not going to tell you how to tin buoys. We're not going to tell you how to jump out of a helicopter and rescue somebody.
Come on.
We'd like to.
You can do that.
Marines don't do that. We just kill people. But what we can ask you to do, and what we need, is a capital investment plan. So we can say, here's how much money you're going to need, so we can go fight for it on your behalf. And we can't do that the way that we've been doing it, which is with our secret handshakes with OMB and the administration, figuring out what you really need, and then adding that to what you ask for. Right? It's not going to go that way forever, because you might have different personalities sitting here and a different personality sitting there, or vice versa, where the handshake control thing just doesn't work. So with that, I'm not sure we accomplished a lot of venting here, but and that's about it, I think. So thank you very much for being here. With that, we're adjourned.
Question.